Lords, Your Excellency. We're moving to the presentation, which is on revolutionizing the ease of access to justice. And to take this presentation is the former Deputy Director General of the Nigerian Law School, Professor FESTUS, EMIRI, Senior Advocate of Nigeria. Please, a round of applause for him as he'll be coming up stage to take the presentation. Please let the applause be better. Thank you so much, sir. Of course, he's also an accomplished public speaker, and each time he speaks, it makes sense. And today will not be an exception. Thank you so much, sir.
His Excellency, the Vice President, Professor Yemi Oshibajo, GCON, SAN, I feel very grateful to have you here. My former teacher, the Chief Judge of Bayelsa State, and all respected persons who are here, all protocols observed. I'm going to be talking about revolutionizing access to justice. And basically, we're talking about how we can do it as a people. This slide tells us what access actually is. Access has two types of two components, the procedural component and the substantive components. Basically, the substantive component is what procedural access is all about. Now, the next slide tells us whether there is access to justice in Nigeria. I'm sure this is a slide many of us are familiar with. It tells us so much. It says the antelope is running mad, and then what does the elephant say? The elephant is asking, he says, why are you running? He says, they are arresting all goats. And he says, in any event, you are not a goat, so why are you running? Well, he says in Nigeria, it would take you 20 years to prove that you are not a goat. And so what did the elephant do? The elephant started running. That's exactly how it is in our country today. Next slide, please. So, do we really want to revolutionize access to justice? The answer is yes. And where should we start from? I've used two points. I've looked at standpoint epistemology and the heuristic positionality. What do we really mean by standpoint epistemology? Standpoint epistemology is just accessing knowledge from the standpoint of the person who has that knowledge. So if we were to ask, for example, that oppression were an entity, and we were to find out what exactly is oppression, if we were to ask the man who is being oppressed and the man who oppresses, whom do we imagine will yield a better understanding of what oppression is? The oppressed, you agree with me? So it means in effect that if you must access knowledge, you should access knowledge from the person who basically is the one who uses the court. And who are court users? What do court users think about justice? Do they really think that there's access? So that's where to start from. But of course, if you're going to find out exactly what oppression is all about, it is not just sufficient to know how the oppressor feels, how the oppressed feels. It's also important to also know how the oppressor feels about it. And that is why we're going to talk about looking at the other perspective, which we call the heuristic positionality. Now, let's look at the next slide. The next slide tells us exactly where we are and why standpoint epistemology makes sense. Some of you are also familiar with this picture. The picture there shows a man who is exhausted in a desert. He needs refreshment. And then the middle picture shows the man taking a bottle of Coca-Cola. And thereafter, you can see the man is thoroughly refreshed and is running. This is a story of a salesman who went to Saudi Arabia. And he put this advert everywhere to sell his Coca-Cola. But he did not sell. Why? Because in Arabic, you don't read from the left to the right. You rather read from the right to the left. So when, of course, they see a man who is agile, running, and the man takes a bottle of Coca-Cola, the man is exhausted. That's exactly what happens when we do not revolutionize access to justice from standpoint epistemology. from the perspective of court users. So that is where to start from. Next slide, please. So we now therefore need to do what we call an assessment. And I do not know of any court in this country that has really assessed court users, how friendly the courts are to them. But overseas, the truth about it is that annually, they do what we call an assessment of the judiciary, an assessment to justice. But in this country, we do not. So we do not care about those who use the court. And therefore, we are like the salesman who thinks that he's doing the right thing while he's actually doing the wrong thing. But we just said that finding out exactly about how access should be should not just be about looking at the position of the oppressed, but also the oppressor can yield basically some ideas about how you can also understand access. So we're going to be looking at what I call heuristic positionality, that is the other perspective outside court users. Who are these persons? So we'll look at the procedural components and we'll take a look at the substantive components. Now, I'm going to look at what we all can do to improve access to justice educationally, by the practice bar, by the judiciary, by the society, and then what I call substantive components. I am an apostle of the civil law jurisdictions. I believe that the civil law is a better law than the common law. In fact, I've written a book which is yet to be published by the Cambridge University Press entitled An Epistemic Analysis of the Common Law Tradition. Now let's talk about the next slide. The next slide talks about, you see a man there, the man has eyes, but his eyes are useless. The reason why the man's eyes are useless is because his mind cannot see very well. When we must talk about access to justice, we must talk about what lawyers can do. And where do we train lawyers from? We train lawyers in the university. Next slide, please. So let's talk about legal education. What can we do about legal education? We still have curricula that is outdated. We do commercial transaction in the university. They talk about hire purchase. I'm not sure anybody still does hire purchase in Nigeria, but that's how the curricula is. And what do we have? We have teachers who come, stand in a class, dictate notes, and students keep writing. That's not education at all. We should stop all that kind of education. We should move from what I call content to concepts. I remember when I was in primary school, I did arithmetic. But nobody does arithmetic anymore. They now do mathematics because we are moving away from content to concepts. For example, when I teach the law of contracts, I use only 2 cases to teach a whole law of contracts. And what are the 2 cases? Cali and Carbolic Smoke Ball Company, and then Midland Silicons. Cali and Carbolic Smoke Ball Company, from me, I set 56 questions. I use it to interrogate invitation to treat, offer, acceptance, consideration, indicia of seriousness, breach of contract, remedies of breach of contract. So we need teachers who can begin to move our classes so that students can begin to think properly, not just telling them these are cases, this is contract. Ask them questions. In the case of Cali and Carbolic Smoke Ball Company, £1,000 was kept. Your idea of contract is all about a bilateral agreement. Was there a bilateral agreement in that case? So you begin to ask them such questions, and when you do such things, then law teachers will be helping our students to teach well. Our teachers don't go to school. Go to any faculty of law, and you'll find that they are empty. The students are not ready to learn. The teachers are not ready to learn. And these are the people who should create access to justice. So we need to also centralize what I call experiential apprenticeship education. A student has finished the law of contract in year 1 or year 2, and the father says, I hear, look, you have done law of contract. Can you draw up a contract for me? And the daughter or son says, I do not know what you're talking about. Why should it be so? I think we should move away from such kind of things. So we need to begin to interrogate legal education properly. And in any event, like the vice president told us, why should we have people conscripted in a place to learn for 1 year compulsorily? What are we teaching them? Can't we move the curriculum of the law school to the universities? And why should university education for law be 5 years in any event? These are things we should begin to interrogate. So when we begin to do some of these things and talk about online learning, then of course we can begin to see that we are helping our students to learn well, and we're creating better access to justice, because in a few years to come, our students will find that as practitioners, they don't need to physically go to court. They can stay in their chambers and argue their cases. I am the only teacher who teaches in my school using Zoom, and everybody fights me because they think I'm doing the wrong thing. I have 2 in-class teaching and then 1 Zoom class. But they say, no, the university doesn't allow such a thing. So we need to begin to think about some of these things and revolutionize, as it were, legal education. We have legal education where people write closed book exams. Don't lawyers go to court with their books? So why do we still have closed book exams in the university for law? It should be open book exams. But the problem is that the lecturers do not know the subjects properly. So they cannot interrogate the higher cognition of the students. And that is why we still have closed book exams. It would interest you to know that the Nigeria Association of Law Teachers in Nigeria has existed for nearly 60 years, and not for once have they interrogated the content of legal education. What they're interested in is election matters, development matters. Those are not the concern for teachers. Teachers should take seriously their business. And that is why some of us have refused to attend the annual conference of law teachers, because it does not interrogate anything of interest to students. Next slide, please. That's also a picture of how we can improve access to justice. That fellow is in a hospital, and the doctor is having an examination of him. And the doctor now asks, says, I'm unable to locate your heart. Can you perhaps be a lawyer? Do you understand that joke? Next slide, please. So what it tells you is that lawyers are just like hired guns. No pro bono service. That's all we do. And how can there be access to justice? So we need to begin to learn properly. We need to expand what I call citizenship lawyering. In fact, qualification to become a judge, to become a senior advocate, you must have required hours of pro bono service. That's how it's done in several other countries. So that's some of the things we need to do. Then I also talk about CLE imperatives. Fortunately, I'm the board chair for the MBA Institute of Continuing Legal Education. Lawyers need to be properly educated if they must improve access to justice. What you see today is that lawyers can't even critically read judgments. Lawyers can't even reason properly. One of the things I do when I teach critical thinking, I use the Solomon's judgment, for example. And I say that if you read it, it's in the Bible, it's about 12 verses. I ask my students to read it 1, 2, 3, 4 times they read, and they are happy. And I ask them a few questions. Can you represent the second woman? And they just think that it's just simply impossible because their minds are closed. And I ask them a few questions. Can you read properly that judgment? The 2 women, were they in the same house and in the same room? They now begin to ask themselves, okay, let me go back and read through the judgment again. I ask them, in any event, Solomon gave the child to one of the mothers, and you think that is right? He says yes. Was that what Solomon wanted to do? He wanted to give the child to the biological mother. They say, oh, that's true. What makes you think that that woman, Solomon says, don't cut the child, is the biological mother? She was just barely a better mother, not necessarily the biological mother. That's the kind of reasoning for which clients will pay you for. So lawyers need to also learn to not only to read, but also to reason properly. And then, of course, we need to centralize what I call persuasive techniques for reasoning. Lawyers basically write too much of logic, but law doesn't always come out in logic. Lawyers must learn to also persuade the heart. So we need to learn like the rhetoricians. We need to learn the way people learn to convince others. Most times I read pleadings of lawyers and I laugh, the plaintiff, the defendants, and all that. I say, judges have heard so many plaintiffs and defendants, so it's more like commodity to them. They are not moved by it. If you lose somebody, you go to a mortuary, you'll be crying. But the attendants don't cry. They just say, "Okay, bring the cloth, make we change the come out, make we come out." Because they have seen so many dead bodies. Judges see plaintiffs and defendants every day. So why don't you write with some good technique of writing? Why don't you describe people in their concrete names? Make them sound concrete. That's the way you are persuading. I tell people, journalists write, novelists write. There are usually two characters in a novel. We have the antagonist and the protagonist. Is that so? But how does it sound if all novels were to say protagonist and antagonist? Would that sound sweet? Nobody will read those novels. So why do they call names? So lawyers need to learn some of these techniques. I have not read any book without a theme. Have you read any book without a theme? Is it interesting? But lawyers every day write briefs without themes. So it is that theme that makes the judge remember what you're talking about. If I say, for example, the difference is clear, and I'm advertising a drink, I'm sure some elderly ones will know what drink I'm talking about. What's that drink? 7-Up. But I'm sure that's not all that was just said in that advert. So many other things were said, but that's the theme. So lawyers need to learn to write briefs with theme and weave the theme across their briefs. That way, they are learning what we call techniques of persuasion. And then lawyers can better represent clients and then create more access to justice. Now the next, please. That's the judiciary. We can see the judges there. Both the sword and the scales are in one hand, but they're not supposed to be in one hand. They're supposed to be in separate hands, one on the right and one on the left. But the only reason for that is because the right hand must be used to pick out something. And what's that? Some money. We all know this. So these are the problems we talk about access to justice. The next slide. So we need a judiciary that is responsive and is also efficient. I remember I did a matter in Yola with another silk on the other side, and we both traveled all the way. I traveled from Yenagoa to Yola. I first went to Lagos. From Lagos, I went to Abuja, from Abuja to Yola. And we were happy. We're in the same hotel, only for us to go to court the next morning, and the registrar said, "Oh, sorry, the court will not sit." I'm sure you experience that usually. These are the kind of things we talk about. So these things rub off on clients, and they now begin to see the courts as not a friendly place. In fact, I've always asked, when we talk about access to justice, anytime I go to the Supreme Court, I wonder if that place is accessible to any man from the river. If you take a man from Southern Ijaw and you take him through that place and say you're going to the Supreme Court, that's where he has a case. By the time he goes through the first branch of SSS men and the second branch of SS men, and he would ask you, "Where are we going to?" Say the Supreme Court. He would say, "I don't want case again." Because it's not friendly. The Supreme Court is not in a place that is friendly at all. Courts are not accessible. So these are some of the things we should begin to talk about. And then we should look at institutional assessment. The courts should assess themselves. Anyone who doesn't assess himself to know what he's doing will be fooling himself. In fact, many years ago, there was this Professor Gill who started the teaching of phrenology, that the size of the brain determines whether one is prone to crime. It was a science at a time until it fell into a disgrace, and it was shown not to be scientific, because they were not assessing themselves. So the courts need to also do what we call assessment, annual assessment of what they are doing and how they are doing it. And like someone would say, let's do the small things and stop talking about the big things. What are the small things? Do the courts all sit at 9? Do the registrars collect money? These are some of the things we all need to fight. When we fight these small things, then the big things will fall in place. Not making new rules of court. We'll have new rules of court for some years now. Has that shortened the lifespan of litigation in the country? Certainly not. So it's not a question of making rules. It's a question of doing the small things that will create access to justice. And I also talk about the substance and style of opinion writing. All over the world, opinion writing is in plain language. In fact, what is going on in the world is that A judgment of any court should be accessible to any litigant, and any litigant should be able to read it with basic education and understand. But I'm sure sometimes you're in court, your client will ask you, what's in the judge talk? But he's there listening. Because we're still talking about the first defendant, plaintiff, respondent in the, why all that description? Even me, I'm confused. Why don't you just use a generic name? The appellant bank, the respondent's hospital. These are small, small things we can do. So we need to think about writing judgments in plain English language. The Supreme Court has delivered judgment about one party, and 2 persons are claiming chairmanship. That's because they have not written plain English. They have not written in plain English. Every judgment must have a disposition, which is the end. The order of court is, and if you take any judgment, for example, Donald Trump in 2023 or so, I can't remember, filed about 67 cases in various courts. Take any of the judgments and read it. In the very, very first paragraph, which we call the orientation paragraph, the orientation paragraph tells you what the litigation is all about, and it tells you the result of the court. And that's how judgments are written everywhere in the world. But if you pick a Nigerian judgment, you don't know what it is until you get to the end. So sometimes you're in court listening to a judgment and you begin to wonder, am I winning this case? Am I winning this case? After all, the thing turns around and you say, ah. This is because we are yet to begin to write judgments the way judgments are written all over the world. So the orientation page, paragraph, is like the executive summary of a judgment. The truth is, even if you take a judgment, what do? The first thing you do, you read a few lines, you go to the end to see what it is all about. So why don't you just tell us in front? How do you think it will feel like if you buy a newspaper and they are going to describe that the vice president was in Bayelsa? They say Bayelsa is such an interesting place. You know, on so and so day, things happened in the SCMD, and they start, and then they'll tell at the end, oh, Professor Oshibajo was here. Does it make sense? That's not a headline. So judgments should be like headlines. So these are some of the things we begin to talk about. And then, of course, diversity is important for the judiciary. In fact, judges who come from diverse background, when they're appointed, can bring a sense of justice to court, and they can create better access to justice, and they can legitimize what courts are to the people. Next slide, please. The people themselves, are they really bothered about whether there's access to justice? That's our society. A man is drowning, and everybody's taking pictures. That's what we're interested in. So next slide. So the people complain about access to justice, but they do nothing substantial about it. So we should have what we call judicial watchdogs. Many years ago, Gunlana, one of my former students, had what was called SQUIB, and they put the judges on their toes and even lawyers on their toes. Why? It tells you when every court sits in Lagos State. So a judge who sits at 11 o'clock, he will see in the SQUIB, or the weekly SQUIB, that he sits at 11 o'clock, and that he only did 2 cases out of 14 cases. So we need some of these things. We need some of these watchdogs. And then, like I will say quickly, that we need to begin to learn to redraft court rules, legislation in simple, plain English language, not using double negatives to describe things. So when we begin to do all of this, then we can be creating what I call better access to justice. Next slide. So we want to rethink now substantive access to justice. I am one person who believes that the common law must begin to rethink its traditions. And what are its traditions? If we begin to look at Roman foundation for law, we can begin to think in a better way. For example, many of the things we now do today in our courts are actually borrowed from the civilian tradition. Mareva injunction, restitution law, pre-trial process, judges being managers, they are all part of the common civil law tradition. So the more of the civil law tradition that we borrow, the better for us. In fact, I am a person who believes that we should, as it were, as a country, begin to practice what I call a mixed legal system. the common law legal system and the civil law legal system. The court's cassation in France can decide as much as 5,000 cases in a year. The Supreme Court cannot decide 100 cases in a year in this country. That's because we have a different way of thinking. We think in bits. The civil lawyer doesn't think in bits, he thinks in broad categories. We have an electoral act. The lawyers will go to court and say, oh, this is pre-election matter, not governed by the act. This is election matter, governed by the act. This is post-election matter. The civil lawyer doesn't think that way. For the civil lawyer, election is to be governed by statutes, and we have created one. What is it? The Electoral Act. Whether it's pre, post, or actual election. That's how to begin to think, so that the Supreme Court can be a court of policy, and people will have confidence in the judiciary, confidence in the legal profession, and then we'll begin to make sense. Next slide. I think I'm almost coming to an end, please. Now, so access reform, as you said, must be courts user-centered with heuristic inputs. Then, of course, there's also a need for lawyers to be proficient in what they do, for judges to be proficient in what they do. Someone once told me a story. He said a man who was a priest, he had agreed to some doctrine of celibacy, that he would marry and such things. But then he went into a convent and picked up a reverend sister. And as he was driving his car, his hands were going round near her laps, and she said, priest, remember Matthew 7, verse 7. And the man would draw his hand back. He did that 3 times, and then dropped her off where she was going to, and quickly ran into his lodge to check what Matthew 7, verse 7 says. And to his surprise, he says, seek, knock. The man was simply not proficient with his business. So lawyers must be proficient, must have public service, and the organized bar should lead reform, and there should be judicial pragmatism. I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor FESTUS EMIRI, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, for that presentation on revolutionizing the ease of access to justice. Thank you so much, sir. I should actually call this panel session for today a star-studded event. Please put your hands together for all our speakers so far. They have done an awesome job.